Okay, welcome to our first timeline. This will be the first of several timelines that we do, and in this first one we're going to start at the very beginning to give us some foundational knowledge about the founding era and the ideas that led to the First Amendment, that undergird the First Amendment, and how it fits into this whole scheme of things. And we're going to start at the beginning. I'm going to have to jump behind the camera and operate the camera, and I'm going to pan across the timeline for note-taking purposes. You'll notice there's a kind of hint with the color coding. So for test-taking purposes, I'll give you enough that you'll know what I'm looking for, and then you'll need to know the parts that are in blue. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start at the very beginning. So our timeline begins in 1619 with the beginning of the slave trade, and that may seem like a strange place to start the story of America, considering we weren't even a country yet. But actually it makes sense. As you'll see throughout the course, this issue ended up becoming a defining thread that runs throughout the history of America. And it is particularly relevant when we're talking about the evolution of constitutional law. And what you might find surprising a few weeks from now, when we get deeper into the course, is just how important that issue was, specifically in terms of the development of First Amendment law. And we'll see that when we get up to the 1950s and 60s. So then, okay, we get 1776, hooray. So Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, and he sends it out to the states for ratification. Of course, that leads to the Revolutionary War, so that wasn't very happy. But here's the third one is one that not many people know, and I think it's a shame. When Jefferson sent out the Declaration of Independence, he also asked for each of the states to write a constitution. Well, this was new. It had never been done. It had never been done in the world. And these state legislators really deserve a lot of credit because they were pioneers. They wrote the very first constitutions. England doesn't have a constitution. England's constitution isn't one document like ours. Instead, it's a series of documents, starting with Magna Carta of 1215. So this was revolutionary to say, okay, what constitutes the American government? We are going to write a constitution to lay out specifically what constitutes. You need to think about the word constitution as a verb. What constitutes the American government? And it did. So they pioneered this idea at the state level. They also all had bills of rights, with things like freedom of religion, of course, freedom of speech. All of them had freedom of speech. 8 of them even had freedom of the press. So then we get to 1781, the Articles of Confederation. And what this really is the precursor to the federal constitution. We didn't have a federal constitution. So they wrote this sort of first draft of the Constitution. And the idea, which we'll talk more about in a subsequent video, was that the states would only be loosely tied together, that we would have a weak federal government and most of the power would reside in the states. And so that was the idea there. So then 2 years later, 1783, the Treaty of Paris, so there's the official end to the Revolutionary War, so that was a good thing. But then on the other hand, it wasn't a good thing because all wars are followed by tough economic times. All wars, it doesn't matter what war, all wars are followed by some economic problems because caused by the debt, war debt. And so the country there was a lot of debt. There was a recession, of course, because recessions almost always follow wars. And the country was really having a hard time. And the problem, they realized, was the Articles of Confederation. It made the federal government simply too weak. And in particular, for example, the federal government didn't have enough power to regulate and manage commerce. Well, that was a big problem. So there was a big economic incentive to change the Articles of Confederation and to give the federal government more power. And so those negotiations started during the Continental Congress. It was actually the Third Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And so all of those smart people got together and tried to figure out how to fix the Articles of Confederation. Well, it was very contentious. We almost didn't get a constitution. In fact, it was so bad that there was talk of breaking the country apart in slave states and non-slave states. So slavery is blowing up in their faces, right? So they should have, if they had solved the problem earlier, perhaps back in 1776. At this point, though, the anti-slavery movement was so strong, and the northern states wanted to use the new constitution to solve the problem, right? They wanted to go ahead and outlaw slavery. Well, the southern states wouldn't have any of it. And so we saw actually a dynamic in politics that we see to this day, and that is the southern states holding the northern states hostage. They basically said, if you want your Constitution, if you don't want us to walk out of this convention, you're going to have to give us these three compromises. The Three-Fifths Compromise was all about representation. The southern states wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted their slaves to be treated like property, but on the other hand, they wanted them to be treated as three-fifths of a person. And the reason was this. And a lot of people don't know this. In many areas in the South, African Americans actually outnumbered whites. And so the whites knew that if you didn't count the slaves, they would not have many representatives in the House of Representatives in Washington. And so, in other words, the northern states would always win. So they got this compromise. They also made this pretty audacious demand. They said for 20 years, you, the federal government, will not discuss slavery and will not do anything about slavery. All right, so it acted as kind of a gag rule. And then finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and that's the one that really angered the northern states. It said that if you knew of a runaway slave, then by law, you had to return that slave to the slave owner. And there could be penalties like fines or jail time. And so it was really galling to the northern states because it was the southern states making the northern states participate in a system that they didn't want to participate in. So then 1789, I'm sorry, I messed up my timeline, sorry. 1789, the Constitution was ratified. And just please add that back where it needs to be. Sorry for that little brain fart. Okay, 1789, the Constitution went to the states ratified. But here's an interesting thing. Not all of the states ratified it because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. North Carolina refused to ratify it. Rhode Island refused to ratify it. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were really angry. Everybody was angry. Didn't have a Bill of Rights. So as soon as it was ratified in 1789, Madison got to work writing the Bill of Rights. And in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, including the First Amendment, and North Carolina and Rhode Island, since they were now satisfied with the Bill of Rights, they ratified the Constitution as well. 1798 was really the first. 1790, I have a really good memory, right? But sometimes I even make mistakes. 1798 was really like the first test of the First Amendment. So John Adams, who was a pretty thin-skinned president, he was tired of people criticizing him. And so he got his buddies in Congress to write the Aliens and Sedition Act. We're not interested in the aliens part. That's about the fight over immigration. We've been fighting about it ever since. The Sedition Act, sedition is to undermine government. And the Sedition Act actually made it a crime to criticize the government. And they were throwing people in jail and fining people for things that they said and that they wrote. And of course, Jefferson and Madison were absolutely outraged. You know, they thought, how can you have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but then you can't criticize the government? That just goes to the central meaning of the First Amendment. So they wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and it was a strong condemnation of the Sedition Act. It was so strong, in fact, that they urged the governments of Kentucky and Virginia to ignore the law and not enforce it. And those governments did. They literally ignored a federal law because they disagreed with it. It's called nullification. 1800, all of that was solved because Jefferson was elected and John Adams left the White House. And when John Adams left the White House, the Sedition Act went away. So that was a good thing. 1801 was a seminal year for us, for this class. The Supreme Court and the court system in general was very weak at this point. If you read the Constitution, the section that lays out the powers of the judicial branch is the skimpiest, most vague part of the Constitution. And so really the power was in Congress, and especially the Senate. So John Marshall came onto the court with a very specific project in mind, and that was that he wanted to increase the power and prestige of the court. And 2 years later, he did that in one fell swoop. in a court case called Marbury v. Madison. This is really the very first important Supreme Court case. And in this court case, John Marshall created, and this is a legal term, judicial review. And just judicial review has a specific definition, so let me give you that definition now so you've got it in your notes. Judicial review is the power of the court to review all actions of all branches of government and deem them constitutional or not. So in a way, the court was elevating itself above the other branches of government, and the court was giving itself a kind of watchdog role. And we'll see how that plays out in the future. But obviously, in one fell swoop, increased the power and prestige of the court. It was a radical notion at the time, actually. But over time, people began to accept it. And that's why people today think of the court as the primary interpreter of the Constitution. And then finally, this era ends. In 1803, the 20-year rule has run its course, and the slave trade ends. And here we are at the end of what will probably be maybe one of the longest videos at 11 minutes. See you next time.